We're back for Your Ears Only. I'm David Alpern.
I'm Melissa Exelberth with a quote from the news. I challenge you to distinguish a naked prostitute from any other naked woman. That was Dominique Strauss-Kahn's lawyer, Henri Leclerc, after the former International Monetary Fund managing director was arrested in connection with orgies he admits attending and possible links to an international prostitution ring, which Strauss-Kahn has denied. Now this.
The United States should always retain military supremacy to deter would-be aggressors and to defend our allies and ourselves.
We should use covert activity, and we should be planning a strike against their facilities and say, if you do not open up those facilities and not close them down, we will close them down for you.
We have to keep this country safe. This is a dangerous place. Make no mistake about it. It's very cute to go and to blame everybody and say we should stay away from anything that smacks of intelligence gathering. The job of our law enforcement is to make sure that they prevent things.
While Republican presidential contenders, with the notable exception of Ron Paul, continue stressing a vision of global military deterrence, even first-strike self-defense against still pre-nuclear Iran, New York Mayor Michael Bloomberg is defending controversial proactive security back home. Specifically, the Associated Press reported last week that his city's police had conducted surveillance of Muslim religious and social institutions in cities and on college campuses across the metropolitan area.
And so it goes. In a nation that since the end of World War II has seen offense as the best defense, with ever-expanding military and intelligence operations that also shape or misshape diplomatic and economic policy and impinge on the U.S. Constitution itself. Such is the picture painted by New York Times editorial writer David C. Unger in a new book titled The Emergency State, America's Pursuit of Absolute Security at All Costs, from the Penguin Press. And to say more about how that state of the state developed and what might be done about it, for your ears only, David Unger joins us now. Welcome to the program.
Well, thank you. I'm really glad to be here.
The emergency state grew through every presidency, starting with Franklin Roosevelt, who died before the end of World War II. What were the most important first steps under FDR?
Well, FDR started the tradition, the bad tradition of presidential war making when he was trying to save Britain from being overrun by the Nazis before Pearl Harbor and was worried about isolation of opinion in the public and the Congress. So he stretched the powers of the commander-in-chief. That's, under wartime circumstances, is one thing, but it became a tradition which continued in the post-war period. He also really is the father of the military-industrial complex in the way he built up the war. And most pernicious and least excusable, he used to consort with J. Edgar Hoover, even behind the backs of his attorney generals, to do surveillance not on subversive, not on enemy agents, he did those too, but on political opponents, on his political opponents in the Congress who were committing no crime.
From the tragedy of 9/11, Mitt Romney and the rest of us should have learned that even being the strongest military power on earth cannot deter all aggressors when modern weapons empower even the smallest groups, and especially those quite willing to die. But you also cite a number of ways in which our military might and security-centered diplomacy actually make the country less safe. Give us an example or two.
Well, the point is that it's not like there's a fixed number of al-Qaeda or other terrorists out there trying to do violence against us, and we simply go in like it's some carnival and shoot down the bad figures, and then they're all gone. Our military actions do kill terrorists, and I'm all in favor of that, but some of our military actions can create terrorists. We're watching what's happening in Afghanistan now with the Koran burning incident and invading Iraq also. I mean, if you look at the number of international terrorists there were before the invasion of Iraq and afterwards, we actually increased the number, and that's not a good arithmetic. Also, by trying to do everything everywhere and not figuring out what our real strategic threats are, we dilute the effectiveness of what we do anywhere. And sometimes by estranging allies in NATO, in the Muslim world, wherever, we weaken our power to combat things, not always by military means, sometimes by diplomatic and political means as well.
On the home front, what do you see as the most serious intrusions on the Constitution?
Well, I would just say secrecy. Secrecy and the expanding of secret presidential powers, because what that does is that's really effectively cut Congress and the public out of information, debate, and democratic decision-making on where we go to war, why we go to war, with what war aims, on trade agreements, on a lot of very consequential things. It really cuts the heart out of our constitutional democracy.
Like Ron Paul in many ways, you say stricter obedience to the Constitution would start reversing the state of permanent emergency, requiring congressional declarations of war, for example. But given the recent history of congressional acquiescence once troops are committed by a president in a crisis, how much difference would that really make?
Well, I think you've got to start somewhere. Congressional debate, public debate has been dumbed down by being short-circuited. I think if you force Congress to step up to its constitutional responsibilities on war making, it will learn to act more seriously because it will own the consequences. The worst consequence of what we have now are orphan wars. If you look at our undeclared wars from Korea forward, Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, you name them, they're presidential wars. They're popular at the beginning. They're popular when they're successful. They're popular when the president is popular. And then, since it was only the president's war, we're sort of free to wish them over and stop thinking about them. And there are our soldiers, not in a national war, not in a constitutional war, but out there dying in a war which is effectively politically orphaned, which is what we see right now.
You propose universal military training or equivalent national service, but not a return to the draft or mobilization. How would that help with an armed force you say is both too small for long-term wars like Iraq and Afghanistan and too large for us to afford in these tight times?
Well, I think it would help in many ways. First of all, I stress this is universal military training, not service. Nobody would be sent into combat unless war was declared or unless they volunteered, as they do now. It would certainly help with the problem of a military which is too small. When we do need ground troops, when we're engaged in actions like Iraq and Afghanistan, assuming that were done lawfully and constitutionally, we'd have a reserve of trained ground troops, and we wouldn't have all the problems we ran into from too few. Too large, fiscal, well, it really depends on the methods we decided for paying them, and also the value of some of the alternative service performed. For example, infrastructure, medical, civilian conservation cost. It's not all cost. Some of it is going to be benefits also. A country like Israel, which is poorer than we are, does this. They can afford it. I think we can afford it too.
New York Times editorial writer David C. Unger. His new book is The Emergency State, America's Pursuit of Absolute Security at All Costs, from the Penguin Press.
Quote from the news, they're moving up in the food chain. That was Kentucky mine workers attorney Tony Oppergard on new federal charges against Gary May, superintendent at the West Virginia coal mine that exploded in 2010, killing 29 miners. He's the highest-ranking mine official charged thus far.
Next, combating the killer of correspondent Anthony Shadid, asthma, for your ears only.